Hi, everybody. Some people wander through the same storms, walk the same broken roads, and without realizing it, are guided by the same destiny, following the same path, sharing the same fate. CEO Toan finally stops at Tu Diem, as if every step before this moment was leading him back to her. Though words remain unspoken, and the past is still heavy with scars, there is a quiet pull between them that neither can deny. In Tu Diem's eyes, Toan sees something that feels like home, even if he cannot explain why. And in that pause, when he chooses to stop, to turn back, to stay, fate whispers that some journeys are not meant to be walked alone. Because when destiny calls softly, the heart knows exactly where to stop. No one could explain why fate could be so cruel and yet so precise at the same time. On an ordinary rural road, where dust clung to footsteps and the afternoon sun stretched shadows thin and long, Tu Diem met the man she loved again, yet he no longer knew who she was. She stood frozen, her heart pounding as if it were about to break free from her chest. The face was unmistakable. The eyes, the posture, even the faint scar near his temple, everything told her it was Toan. The man who once stood tall as a CEO, confident, decisive, and full of dreams. The man who had promised to build a future with her. But now, those same eyes were filled with fear. When Tu Diem called his name, his body stiffened. He looked at her as though she were a stranger, as though her voice carried danger instead of love. She stepped closer, instinctively reaching out to hold him, to anchor him to the memories they once shared. But the moment her arms touched him, he recoiled. Panic flashed across his face. He pushed her away and ran. That moment shattered something deep inside Tu Diem. She stood there, breathless, unable to move, watching the man she loved disappear down the dusty road, running not from the world, but from her, from his past. Why was he so afraid? Why did he look at her as if she had never existed? Her mind spiraled with questions she dared not answer. Had something terrible happened to him? An accident? A betrayal? A wound so deep it erased his memories? The way he clutched his head, the way his eyes darted around in terror, it was not acting, not pretense. It was the fear of someone who had lost more than just direction. He had lost himself. Tu Diem felt a cold realization settle in her chest. Perhaps Toan no longer knew who he was. Perhaps the life they once built together existed only in her memories now. As she stood alone on that road, surrounded by the familiar sounds of rural life, workers passing by, distant voices calling out, the rustle of leaves, she felt strangely disconnected from everything. Life around her continued as usual, indifferent to the storm raging inside her heart. Yet even in that pain, a fragile thought took root. If he had run, it meant he was alive. If he was alive, he must be somewhere nearby. And if fate had allowed them to cross paths once more, perhaps it was not to end the story, but to begin a far more painful, uncertain chapter. Morning arrived quietly, the way it always did in the countryside, without asking anyone if they were ready. The sky turned pale, roosters crowed somewhere far away, and life resumed its simple rhythm. But for Tu Diem, the world no longer felt simple at all. That day, she went to work as usual, her hands busy, her mind elsewhere. Every step she took along the dirt paths felt like a question without an answer. She asked villagers she passed, workers resting under trees, elderly women sweeping their yards, carefully, respectfully, if they had seen a man like the one in her memory, a tall figure, quiet, often carrying a sack, walking alone, as if the road were the only place that would accept him. Some shook their heads. Some looked at her with curiosity. Some said, maybe, and then turned away. While Tu Diem searched, Toan lived a life stripped down to its barest form. No name, no past, only the weight of survival pressing on his shoulders. Each morning, he followed the others into the orchards, climbing trees, hauling heavy sacks of pomelos until his arms burned and his breath grew ragged. His hands, once used to signing contracts and shaking hands in boardrooms, were now rough, scarred, and trembling from exhaustion. At mealtime, he sat quietly among the workers. When asked his name, he smiled awkwardly and shook his head. "I don't know," he said softly, and somehow that hurt more in silence. People whispered about him. He didn't look like a laborer, they said. Too clean-cut, too refined. Yet he carried heavier loads than most, never complained, never argued, as if hard work were his way of punishing himself for a life he could no longer remember. From afar, Tu Diem watched. She saw him lift sacks twice his size, eat hurried meals, sleep wherever night found him. Each sight pierced her heart like a quiet blade. She wanted to run to him, to call his name again, to force memory back into his mind through sheer love alone. But fear stopped her. She remembered his eyes, the panic, the way he fled. So she stayed back, hiding beneath the shade of trees, pretending to rest, pretending to be just another passerby. In that distance, she felt the cruel irony of everyday life, how two people could breathe the same air, walk the same land, yet live in entirely different worlds. Fate had not separated them by distance. It had separated them by memory. And as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, Tu Diem wondered how long a person could survive without knowing who they were, or who was still waiting for them. That evening, the sky turned the color of fading embers, and the house felt unusually quiet. Tu Diem sat by the doorway, her hands resting on her knees, her thoughts heavy with everything she had seen and everything she dared not do. Hope, once so fragile, now trembled inside her, afraid to rise, afraid to fall. She could no longer carry this alone. When she finally spoke, her voice shook as if it might disappear at any moment. She told Auntie and Thu everything, how she had seen Toan on the road, how he didn't recognize her, how he ran in fear as though she were a stranger sent to harm him. Every word felt like reopening a wound, but she forced herself to continue, because silence had already hurt enough. Auntie froze, her broom slipping from her hand. Thu frowned deeply, replaying every detail in his mind. The room filled with questions, with disbelief, with worry thick enough to touch. Then something must have happened to him, Thu said at last. No one forgets everything without a reason. Those words, simple as they were, became the first small light in the darkness. They talked late into the night, about accidents, about trauma, about people who disappeared and returned as strangers to their own lives. Auntie wiped her eyes quietly, murmuring prayers under her breath. Tu Diem listened, her heart aching, yet strangely lighter, because for the first time, she was no longer alone in her fear. The next morning, Phu went to work with a purpose. Between meetings and hurried phone calls, he reached out to old connections, former colleagues, anyone who might know something. Somewhere between official reports and whispered conversations, a thin thread of hope began to form. Meanwhile, Tu Diem waited. She waited like people do in everyday life, between cooking meals, sweeping the yard, glancing at the road whenever footsteps passed by. Waiting became her routine, her silent prayer. Each sound outside made her heart jump. Each quiet moment felt endless. Then, as dusk settled once more, the phone rang. Phu answered. His expression changed with every second. Surprise, relief, disbelief. When he finally looked at Tu Diem, his eyes were filled with something she hadn't seen in days. "We found him," he said softly. "We know where Toan is living." For a moment, Tu Diem couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to blur, the walls, the floor, the fading light. Then tears came, unstoppable, falling not from pain this time, but from hope. Tomorrow they would go to him. Tomorrow fate would test them again. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, Tu Diem realized, Hope does not arrive loudly. It whispers, just enough to keep a heart alive. That night felt longer than any night Tu Diem had ever known. Sleep refused to come, as if even time itself was holding its breath. Outside, the village settled into silence. Dogs curled up by doorsteps, lamps dimmed one by one, the familiar rhythm of everyday life continuing as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. But inside Tu Diem's heart, everything was awake. She lay still, staring into the darkness, replaying every memory she shared with Toan. The way he once smiled when the farm bloomed in spring. The way he spoke about the future as if it were something they could build with their own hands. Those memories felt close enough to touch, yet unbearably far, like a dream fading at sunrise. Morning came before she realized she had never slept. The road ahead was quiet as they set off. Thu trove slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might shatter the fragile hope they carried. Tu Diem sat beside him, hands clenched, heart pounding with every passing mile. Outside the window, daily life unfolded, vendors opening their stalls, farmers heading to the fields, children walking to school. Ordinary moments, unaware that for her, this journey could change everything. What if he still didn't recognize her? What if fear filled his eyes again? The questions rose and fell like waves, crashing against her resolve. She reminded herself of one thing. This time, she would not rush. She would not reach for him and send him running. Love, she had learned, sometimes meant standing still. When they finally arrived, Tu Diem's steps faltered. The place was modest, almost invisible, just another corner of the world where forgotten people quietly survived. Somewhere nearby, Toan was living a life far removed from the man he used to be. She didn't see him yet, but she felt him. Her breath caught as she waited, listening to distant footsteps, to voices carried by the wind. Each sound made her heart tighten with anticipation. This was the edge of everything, the line between past and present, between remembering and forgetting. She whispered to herself, not as a plea, but as a promise. I'm here. I won't scare you. I won't leave. Whether he remembered her or not, whether fate reunited them or tested them further, Tu Diem knew one thing with painful clarity. Some people don't need memories to be bound together. Sometimes destiny is enough. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light onto the road ahead, their stories stood on the threshold, waiting to be continued.